I buried my wife on a Tuesday. By Friday, I was raising 2 kids who weren't mine to raise. That's not a complaint. I want to be clear about that from the start. I would do it again without a single moment of hesitation. But I want you to understand what my life looked like before any of this happened, before the lawyers and the courtrooms and the handcuffs, so that you understand exactly what was taken from me and exactly what I fought to get back. My name is Harold. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for the county, which means I spent 31 years making sure that bridges didn't fall down and that the roads people drove on every morning wouldn't crack and swallow them whole. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. And when you've spent your whole career making sure things hold together, it gets into your bones. You start to see the world in terms of what's load-bearing and what isn't, what you can remove and still have something standing, and what you pull out and watch the whole structure collapse. My son, Daniel, was load-bearing for me. He was my only child. My wife, Carol, and I had tried for years before he came along, and when he did, she cried for 3 days straight. Not from sadness, but from the kind of relief that has nowhere else to go. We raised him in a yellow house on the edge of Millhaven, Georgia. A town small enough that everybody knew your car before they knew your name. Daniel was a good kid. Not perfect. He had a temper that came and went like weather, and he never quite learned how to sit still with discomfort. But he was good at his core. I believed that. He met Vanessa when he was 26. She was pretty and sharp-tongued and laughed loudly at things that weren't quite funny. And I remember thinking the first time I met her that she was performing. Not lying, exactly. Just always performing. Carol liked her. I kept my thoughts to myself. They married fast. Within 2 years they had a daughter, Maya. And then 18 months after that, a son, Caleb. I watched my grandchildren come into the world, and I felt something reset in my chest, the way a compass finds north. Those 2 kids were the best thing Daniel ever did. The marriage was not the best thing Daniel ever did. I won't speak badly of Vanessa, even now, even after everything. What I'll say is that by the time Maya was 4 and Caleb was 2, the house Daniel and Vanessa lived in had become a place where voices were always raised and doors were always slamming. I know because we lived 11 minutes away. And Daniel would show up on our porch sometimes at 10 o'clock at night with that tight jaw he used to get as a boy when he didn't want to cry in front of me. Carol passed when Caleb was 3. Pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I've never talked publicly about that period of my life because I don't have the words for it that would do it justice. What I'll say is that losing Carol was like having the floor pulled out from under every room in my life simultaneously. 4 months after the funeral, Daniel knocked on my door with both kids in tow and a duffel bag in each hand. He had a job offer, he said. Offshore oil platform work off the Louisiana coast. Good money, he said. Real money. He and Vanessa were taking some time apart, he said. And this job would give him the space to think. Just until things settled down. Just for a little while. Maya was 5. She was standing in my entryway in her yellow rain boots, even though it wasn't raining, holding a stuffed rabbit named Gerald with both hands. Caleb was 3.5, and already asleep on Daniel's shoulder. How long? I asked him. He set the bags down. He didn't look me in the eye. I'll call you, he said. I'll send money. He kissed both kids. He walked to his truck. He drove away. I stood there in the door for a long moment, looking at my granddaughter in her rain boots and my grandson asleep against my shoulder. And I made a decision that was not really a decision at all. It was the only thing I was capable of doing. I brought them inside. I made grilled cheese. I found the channel with cartoons. I put them both to bed in the room that used to be Daniel's. That was 8 years ago. Daniel sent money the first 3 months. Not enough, but something. The calls came less and less. By the end of the first year, the calls were maybe once every 6 weeks, and they were short, and he always sounded like he was somewhere loud. By the second year, Vanessa had filed for divorce. I found that out not from Daniel but from a letter that arrived at my house addressed to him, a legal notice forwarded from his last known address. By the third year, The calls had stopped entirely. I raised Maya and Caleb the way you raise children, when you know exactly how fast time moves and you're not willing to waste a single Tuesday of it. I went to every school play. I learned how to braid hair. Badly at first, and then pretty well. I coached Caleb's little league team for 2 seasons. I packed lunches and argued about bedtimes, and sat up at night when one of them had a fever and felt, beneath all the exhaustion, the specific gratitude of a person who knows they have been given something they don't deserve. My neighbor across the street, Ray, was 67 and retired from the post office and had nothing but time and opinions about everything. He became, over those years, my closest friend. He would come over on Saturday mornings and drink coffee at my kitchen table and pretend he was just passing through, and he would stay until noon. He watched the kids sometimes when I had appointments. He fixed my gutters without being asked. He was the kind of person who would drive 40 miles in the rain if you needed him to, and he wouldn't mention it afterward. Maya was 12 when she started asking harder questions about her father. I told her the truth, as much of it as I thought she could carry at the time. He loved her. He had problems I didn't fully understand. He had made choices that hurt people. I never spoke about it with anger. I said it the same way I would explain a structural failure. Here is what happened. Here is why it didn't hold. By the time Maya was 13, she had stopped asking. Caleb was quieter about it. He had been so young when Daniel left that he had no real memory of him. As far as Caleb was concerned, I was his father. He didn't say that in words. He didn't need to. I knew it by the way he would come and stand next to me while I was cooking, not asking for anything, just standing there. Then one afternoon in March, 8 years after Daniel had driven away, a black SUV pulled into my driveway, and a woman I didn't recognize got out. She was in her 40s, dressed in a blazer, with the particular walk of someone who's rehearsed what they're about to do. She introduced herself. Her name was Patricia. She was an attorney. Behind her, getting out of the passenger side, was Vanessa. I hadn't seen Vanessa in 8 years. She had changed the way people change when money has entered the picture. The way she carried herself said she hadn't come to talk. She had come to collect. I learned the story in pieces over the next several days, and then all at once when the paperwork arrived. Daniel had died 14 months earlier. Offshore accident. There had been a life insurance policy. It was substantial, and because Daniel had never legally established custody of the children with me, because no paperwork had ever been signed, because Vanessa was still the children's legal mother, despite having walked out of their lives when Caleb was 3 years old, she was entitled to claim the children, and, in doing so, claim Daniel's life insurance disbursement, which was structured to follow the children's primary guardian. She had waited 14 months to come. I would find out later that she had spent that time consulting attorneys and making sure her case was airtight before she showed up at my door. Patricia, the attorney, handed me a document and explained in a tone that was almost kind that I had been raising 2 minors without legal authority for 8 years, that Vanessa was their mother, that she had legal standing, that the matter was being referred to the county sheriff's office on the grounds of unlawful detainment of minors. Unlawful detainment. I read the words twice. I looked up at Vanessa. She was looking at the yard, not at me. "These are my grandchildren," I said. Patricia said that the courts would sort everything out. "Their father left them here," I said. "He knocked on my door and left them here. I've been raising them for 8 years. Do you have documentation of that arrangement?" Patricia asked. I didn't. Because it hadn't been an arrangement. It had been a Tuesday evening, and a duffel bag, and a son who wouldn't meet my eyes. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy I had known for 20 years showed up at my door with a look on his face that told me he wasn't happy about what he'd been asked to do. There was a court order, an emergency custody motion, granted based on Vanessa's petition. The children were to be remanded to Vanessa's care, pending a full custody hearing. Maya was in the kitchen doing homework. Caleb was in the backyard, throwing a baseball against the back fence, the way he did when he needed to think. I called them both inside and I told them what was happening in as calm a voice as I could manage. Maya immediately began to cry. Caleb went very still in the way he had since he was small, which was how I knew he was terrified. "You can't let them do this, Grandpa," Maya said. "I'm going to fight this," I told her. "I need you to trust me." The deputy was decent about it. He let me hug them both for a long time before they had to go. As they walked to Vanessa's SUV, Caleb turned and looked at me over his shoulder, and it was the hardest thing I have ever stood through in my life. Harder than watching Carol's casket. Because at least with Carol, I understood there was nothing left to do. With Caleb looking at me like that, there was everything still left to do, and I didn't know yet if I was capable of doing it. I sat at my kitchen table for about an hour after they left. Then I called Ray. He was at my door in 4 minutes. He sat across from me and listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not his natural inclination. And when I finished, he put his coffee down and said, "What do you need?" I told him I needed a lawyer and I needed to find Daniel's original voicemails. Let me explain the voicemails. In the first year after Daniel left the children with me, before the calls stopped entirely, he had called me a dozen times from various numbers. Some of those calls I had saved to my old phone because they were the only proof I had of his voice still existing somewhere in the world. I hadn't listened to them in years, but I remembered one, in particular, a call from about 11 months after he left. He had been drinking, or maybe just tired. He had rambled for several minutes about the job and the money and how he needed more time. And then he had said, very clearly, "I know you're taking care of them. I know they're with you. I just need you to keep doing it a little longer. I need you to keep doing it a little longer." That was not the voicemail of a man whose children had been taken from him without his knowledge. That was a man who had made a deliberate choice and was asking his father to cover the consequences of that choice. The problem was the phone was 4 years old, and I wasn't certain it still powered on. Ray drove me to the cell phone store the following morning. The phone powered on. The voicemails were still there. Ray stood next to me in the store parking lot and listened to me play them back. And when we got to the one I remembered, he was quiet for a moment. "That's it," he said. "That's it," I said. But that wasn't all I needed. I needed that recording to be admissible. I needed a lawyer who knew what they were doing, and I needed to prove not just that Daniel had consented to leaving the children, but that Vanessa had been an absent parent with full awareness that the children were in my care. My attorney, a woman named Louise who had been practicing family law in our county for 22 years, told me we were building a strong case, but that there was one obstacle she was concerned about. Vanessa's team was going to argue that she had been in contact with the children regularly, that she had sent money, that she had been a present mother operating under the assumption that I was simply helping Daniel, not acting as the children's sole guardian without authorization. "Can she prove any of that?" Louise asked me. "She can claim it," I said. "Whether she can prove it is another question." This was where things got complicated, because Vanessa had, in the 8 years the children were with me, sent exactly 4 birthday cards. I had kept them. I don't know why I kept them. Old habit from working in a field where documentation is everything. I kept them in a folder in my filing cabinet, and when I pulled them out and gave them to Louise, she looked at them for a long moment and said, "4 cards in 8 years. That's your counter-argument right there." But Vanessa's attorney had done something clever. She had found 2 people in town who were willing to testify that Vanessa had spoken to them about her children regularly and had expressed ongoing concern for their welfare. One of them was a woman from the church I used to attend. The other was a man I recognized but didn't know well, someone who had moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago. Louise told me the testimonies were thin, but that a sympathetic judge might give them weight. I didn't sleep much that week. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning more than once, going through files, going through memories, trying to think about what else I had. School records were in my name. Medical records were in my name. I had been the sole signatory on everything related to those children for 8 years. But Vanessa's attorney was arguing that this was evidence of unauthorized action, not authorized guardianship. She was flipping every piece of evidence I had and using it against me. Ray came by every evening that week. He would sit with me, and we would go through it together. This old man and his older neighbor at a kitchen table, trying to figure out how to hold something together. On the 4th night, Ray said. Did you ever write anything down? Any of those early conversations with Daniel? Any notes? I hadn't. But I remembered something. The morning Daniel had left the children, he had been in a hurry. He had carried the bags in, and he had been looking for a pen to write down a phone number for me. The number for his supervisor on the platform. Someone I could contact if there was an emergency. He had found a notepad on my counter. He had written the number down. And then, because he was Daniel, and because some part of him knew what he was doing, he had written something else below it, something I hadn't thought about in years, because the number had stopped working within 6 months anyway. He had written, "Kids are with Dad. He knows the situation." D. I had kept the notepad. I had kept it in the same kitchen drawer I'd put it in that Friday, under takeout menus and rubber bands and the accumulated debris of a household run by one person. I went to that drawer at 2 in the morning while Ray sat at my table, and I pulled out every piece of paper in it. And at the bottom, creased and slightly stained from a coffee ring, was the notepad. "Kids are with Dad. He knows the situation." D. Ray looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. "That's Daniel's handwriting?" he asked. "That's Daniel's handwriting," I said. "And that can be verified?" "His divorce documents have his signature. His employment records have his handwriting. Yes, it can be verified." Ray sat back in his chair. He was smiling in the way he smiles when something has been decided. "Harold," he said, "I think we've got her." Louise brought in a handwriting expert. It took 10 days to get the analysis, but when it came back, it was clear. The handwriting on the notepad matched Daniel's signature on file across 3 separate legal documents. The note was authentic. The custody hearing was held on a Thursday morning in May. The courtroom was small, and the air conditioning was aggressive, and I sat at the defendant's table in the suit I had last worn to Carol's funeral. And I felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to calm. Vanessa's attorney went first. She was good. She painted a picture of a concerned mother who had trusted a family member to assist with childcare and returned to find that family member had constructed an unauthorized parallel life for her children. She used the phrase, "acting outside the scope of his role" 3 times. She made me sound like someone who had stolen something. The 2 witnesses testified. The churchwoman said she remembered Vanessa expressing worry about the children. The neighbor said the same. Louise cross-examined them both, and what emerged was that neither of them could name a single specific incident. No dates, no details, just general impressions of a concerned mother. Then, Louise presented our case. The voicemail came first. The judge, a man named Irwin, who looked to be in his late 50s and had the face of someone who has heard every possible version of every possible story, listened to it twice. When it finished the second time, he made a note on his pad. Then the 4 birthday cards. Louise laid them on the evidence table with the dates visible. 4 cards in 8 years. No phone records showing calls to the household. No financial records showing any contribution to the children's welfare beyond a single wire transfer in year 1 for $300. Then the school records. 8 years of enrollment, emergency contacts, parent-teacher conference signatures, all in my name. The medical records, same. Then, the notepad. Louise placed it in front of the judge and let him read it. He read it once. He read it again. He looked up at Vanessa's table. "Is this the father's handwriting?" he asked. Vanessa's attorney began to say something about the chain of custody of the document. The judge held up one hand. "I'm asking a factual question," he said. "Has the handwriting been analyzed?" Louise presented the expert's report. The judge was quiet for almost a full minute. In that silence, I could hear the air conditioning and the sound of someone in the hallway outside and my own heartbeat. "Mr. Harold," the judge said, looking at me, "your son wrote this note the day he left his children in your care?" "Yes, sir," I said. "And you have raised these children since that day?" "Yes, sir." "And the children's mother," he said, turning to Vanessa's side of the room, "sent 4 birthday cards in 8 years and 1 wire transfer and has presented no evidence of ongoing contact or financial contribution. Vanessa's attorney was on her feet, but the judge was already making another note. What happened next was not dramatic in the way courtroom scenes look in movies. There was no outburst, no sudden revelation, no moment where someone slammed their hand on the table. What happened was that the judge asked Vanessa's attorney whether she had any evidence to counter the documentation presented, and Vanessa's attorney said she would need time to gather additional materials, and the judge said the emergency custody order had placed 2 children with a woman they hadn't lived with since one of them was 3 years old, based on an allegation that had now been materially contradicted by the opposing party's own documentation, and he was not inclined to allow that situation to continue while additional materials were gathered. He suspended the emergency custody order pending a full evidentiary hearing. The children came home that afternoon. Maya walked through my front door and went straight to her room without saying anything, and I heard her crying through the door for a little while. And then she came back out, with red eyes, and sat down next to me on the couch and put her head on my shoulder. Caleb came in behind her, set his bag down, looked at me with those steady eyes, and said, "I told her you would fix it." "And I had help," I said. "Ray?" "Ray." Caleb nodded, like this confirmed something he already knew. "I want to tell you about Ray, because he deserves more than a footnote in this story. He had done more than sit at my kitchen table and drink my coffee. He had driven me to the phone store. He had sat with me at 2 a.m. going through every piece of paper I owned. He had gone, on his own initiative, to speak with the school principal and with the children's pediatrician to gather character statements, both of whom provided written affidavits without hesitation. He had called his nephew, who was a retired judge in a neighboring county, to get a second opinion on our legal strategy. He had done all of this without being asked and without mentioning it until it was done. The night after the children came home, Ray came over and I made dinner. A real dinner. The pot roast Carol used to make that I had learned to replicate over the years. And the 4 of us sat at the table together. After dinner, I went to the small safe in my bedroom closet, and I took out an envelope I had prepared the day before. I put it on the table in front of Ray. He looked at it. "What is this?" "Open it." He opened it. He looked at what was inside, and then he looked at me. "Harold, I can't take this." "You're going to take it," I said. "And you're not going to argue with me about it, because I outrank you." "You don't outrank me. I'm older, by 2 years. Open margins," I said. He laughed, which was what I wanted. He folded the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't mention it again that evening, which was also what I wanted. And percentile, he wanted to 2-3 presented. We're leading 2-3.23 process. The full evidentiary hearing happened 6 weeks later. Vanessa's attorney arrived with additional witnesses, but Louise had spent 6 weeks building a case that was as tight as anything I had ever engineered. The handwriting analysis, the phone records, subpoenaed, showing no calls from Vanessa's numbers to my household in the past 4 years. Financial records confirming 0 contribution. School and medical affidavits. The voicemail played again. Daniel's voice in that courtroom saying, "I know you're taking care of them. I need you to keep doing it." And Louise had done one more thing. She had requested the children's own testimony. The judge had been reluctant to put children through a formal hearing. Louise had submitted a motion requesting that he speak with them privately in chambers, which was standard practice in contested custody cases. The judge had agreed. I don't know exactly what Maya and Caleb said in that room. They didn't tell me, and I didn't ask, because whatever they said was theirs to say. What I know is that when the judge came back to the bench after speaking with them, he had a look on his face that told me the conversation had not been ambiguous. He ruled in my favor. Full guardianship, with the provision that I would begin the formal legal process to establish permanent custody, which Louise had already begun filing paperwork for before we even left the courthouse. He noted in his ruling that the original emergency custody order had been granted on incomplete information and that the documentation provided by the respondent demonstrated a clear pattern of established, consensual, long-term caregiving. He noted that the children had expressed in unambiguous terms their preference and their understanding of their own situation. He also noted, in language that was measured and judicial but unmistakably pointed, that the court took a dim view of attempts to characterize long-term family caregiving as unlawful detainment in circumstances where the parent initiating that claim had themselves been voluntarily absent. Vanessa left the courthouse without speaking to me. I watched her go and I felt, I'll be honest with you, very little. Not triumph, not anger, just the particular exhaustion of a long fight that has reached its end. Louise shook my hand outside the courthouse steps. Ray had driven me that day and he was waiting by the car. I walked over, and he was already grinning. "Well?" he said. "Well," I said. He slapped me on the shoulder hard enough that I had to take a step. On the drive home, the windows down, because it was May in Georgia, and the air was doing what it does in May, I thought about Daniel. I thought about the version of him that had knocked on my door with those 2 duffel bags and my grandchildren asleep on his shoulder. And I tried to understand what that moment had looked like from inside his head. A man who was failing at everything and could see it clearly, and whose only move was to leave the most important things he had in the safest place he knew, which was my house, which was with me. He had been wrong to do it the way he did. He had been wrong not to call, not to stay, not to give me the legal standing I would need 8 years later when his choices came back around. But he had not been wrong about where to leave them. I told Caleb about his father's death that evening. He was 11 now. I had been waiting for the right time, and I had been wrong to wait. But sometimes you protect people with delay, and you just have to own that when the time comes. He sat with it for a long time. We were on the back porch, and the sky was doing something complicated with the light the way it does in May evenings in Georgia. "Did he know about us?" Caleb asked. "Like, did he know how we were doing?" "I believe so," I said. "I believe he kept track, in the ways he could." Caleb was quiet again. Then he said, "I'm not angry. You're allowed to be." "I know," he said. "I'm just not." Maya handled it differently, with questions and tears, and then a period of silence that lasted several days. I let her move through it, at her own pace. On the 4th day she came and found me in the garage where I was fixing a shelf that had been leaning for 6 months, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Do you think he would have come back? Eventually?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. She nodded. She went back inside. That evening she came down to dinner and asked if we could make Carol's pot roast again, the one I had made for Ray, and I said yes, and we made it together, Maya and I, with Caleb sitting on the counter reading aloud from a book about baseball statistics that he had been carrying around for 3 weeks, and the kitchen smelled like onions and rosemary, and something that was not quite the past, but was adjacent to it. That is my story. I tell it not to make Vanessa a villain, because her grief for a man who had failed them both was real. And grief makes people do things they can't fully account for later. I tell it because there are a lot of people in situations like mine. People who stepped into a gap that someone else left. People who built something real without the paperwork to prove it. And I want them to know that the paperwork, as it turns out, is less powerful than the truth of what you actually did. I tell it because of the notepad in the kitchen drawer. Because of Daniel's handwriting, that particular slope to his letters that I would recognize anywhere. Kids are with Dad. He knows the situation. He knew the situation. So did everyone who had ever been inside my house for the past 8 years. So did the principal and the pediatrician and the neighbors and every coach and teacher and Sunday school volunteer who had watched me show up every single time for 8 years. The paperwork matters. I know that now. But in the end, what the judge ruled on was not the paperwork. It was the weight of 8 years of showing up. Every day. Pressing down on one side of the scale. And on the other side was 4 birthday cards. I have custody of my grandchildren. Maya is 13 and building a competitive case for why she should have a later bedtime, which I am resisting on principle. Caleb is 11 and has decided he wants to be an engineer, which he announced at dinner one evening with the casual certainty of someone who has never doubted anything in his life. Ray still comes over on Saturday mornings. He still pretends he's just passing through. Some things, when they're load-bearing, you don't remove.